Rule of thumb. Rule of thumb. I am sure you have heard that term, and you likely know what it means. And you may have even heard that the origin of the term rule of thumb somehow related to spousal abuse. So, what is the true origin of this phrase, and what exactly does it mean? You and I will answer these questions in this episode of History of Everyday Sayings. Hello, Stephen Carter here, and I am your host for the History of Everyday Sayings. I thank you for joining me. Who is this show for? If you are a logophile, a philomath, or you are someone who simply loves history tidbits you can share with friends and family, this show is for you. You'll find previous episodes for this show as well as other shows designed to help you de-stress and to entertain. Those shows will all be available at stressreliefradio.com, stressreliefradio.com. Rule of thumb. What does the phrase really mean? We will begin our investigation at phrases.org.uk. That site tells us a rule of thumb is a means of estimation made according to a rough and ready practical rule, not based on science or exact measurement. I have no doubt that you have heard this phrase, and likely you knew it was a phrase that related to an approximation, a rule of action that, by and large, is generally true or generally effective. What about the origin of the phrase rule of thumb? Continuing with phrases.org.uk, the rule of thumb has been said to derive from the belief that English law allowed a man to beat his wife with a stick so long as it was no thicker than his thumb. And I do have to confess, this was my belief for the origin of this phrase until I engaged in this investigation. I have told this story many, many times as the origin of rule of thumb. But alas, the actual origin is quite different. While it is true that English common law once held that it was legal for a man to chastise his wife in moderation, the rule of thumb, well, that's never really been law in England. It has never been law in the United States, and in most other countries, you are not allowed to beat your wife. As to the origin of the term rule of thumb, well, that myth continues to be propagated. The origin of the myth goes back to 1782. It is said that Judge Sir Francis Buller, Buller, reportedly made a legal ruling, and in the following year, James Gilray, who was a political cartoonist at the time, James Gilray published a satirical cartoon attacking Buller and characterized him as Judge Thumb. Gilray's cartoon shows a man beating a fleeing woman and Buller carrying 2 bundles of sticks. The caption reads, "Thumb sticks for family correction, warranted lawful." Now, it was true that the good Judge Buller did have a reputation for being hard on those who came before him. He also had a reputation for arrogance. However, there is no evidence that he ever made the ruling that was attributed to him. A researcher by the name of Edward Foss, in his authoritative work, The Judges of England, published 1870, wrote that despite a searching investigation, no substantial evidence has been found that he ever expressed so ungallant an opinion. Phrases.org.uk continues, despite the phrase being in common use since the 17th century and appearing many thousands of times in print, there are no printed records that associate it with domestic violence until the 1970s, when the notion was castigated by feminists. They portrayed that this was actually a legal ruling, that wife beating was legal, and this source also references the Rolling Stones song Under My Thumb, that song recorded in 1966. The truth of the matter is, the phrase itself has been in circulation since the 1600s. The earliest known use of it in print appears to be in a sermon given by the English Puritan James Durham and printed in Heaven Upon Earth, 1658, and that quote, "Many professed Christians are like two foolish builders who build by the guess, by the rule of thumb, and not by the square and rule." This source tells us the phrase origin does remain unknown and goes on to suggest perhaps it was used by carpenters, artists, and those who brew beer, using the thumb to measure the temperature of the beers. The earliest such measurement use that I can find, and again this continues from phrases.org, is in a journal of amusing tales with the comprehensive title of Wits, Recreations, Augmented and Ingenious Conceites for the Witty and Merry Medicines of the Melancholic, and that was published in 1640. If Hercules' tall stature might be guessed by his thumb, the index of the rest in due proportion, the best rule that I would choose to measure Venus' beauty by should be her leg and foot. But the rule of leg, well, that never really caught on. Let us look at one more source for this investigation, that being the New York Times Magazine, for the article on language misrule of thumb. On language misrule of thumb, this by William Safire, dated January 25, 1998. He begins this article with a quote by the Vice President of George Washington University, an excellent university, by the way. The Vice President's name was Lewis Katz, and he writes, "We had to go by rule of thumb," said Lewis Katz, Vice President of the George Washington University, explaining some funding problems to the G.W. Hatchet, an independent student newspaper. This seemingly innocent figure of speech drew fire from a female student by the name of Jess Bren, who wrote, quote, "For the unaware, in English vernacular, the rule of thumb refers to an obvious solution of doing things the way they have always been done. However, the phrase originated in English common law, where a man was permitted to beat his wife as long as the rod he used was no bigger than the width of his thumb. She excoriated the misogynistic connotations disrespectful to women and men alike." And while assuming the university official intended no disrespect, she continued, "We should all know what we're saying and where the phrases we use come from." Close quote. And I would say she's absolutely right. We do need to investigate the true origin of the phrases that we use and not assume that some offhand comment by someone who is not a proper investigator is the truth. I will have links to both of the sources used in this episode Those links will be in the episode show notes. If you're not yet following History of Everyday Sayings where you get your podcasts, this is a perfect time to do that. When you follow, you will never miss an episode. Speaking of episodes, you'll find previous episodes on our website at stressreliefradio.com. stressreliefradio.com. If you would like to be in touch, email me at cartermethod@gmail.com. And by the way, if you have a phrase you are curious about the origin of, send that phrase to me in an email, and I will certainly have a look and do a proper investigation. Until our next visit together, your host, Steve Carter, wishing for you and your loved ones blessings in abundance.